Yeah, so I'm an English professor. I'm a professor of creative writing. And as if one English professor isn't enough, I'm going to start off by introducing my colleague and my wife, Sue Ellen Campbell, another English professor, to talk about the first slide after this one.
So I have about 30 seconds just to say that we have a poster over there. We're called Changing Climates at Colorado State University. We have run a lot of talks. We run a website, and we do some communication training. And I particularly wanted to say about the website, because I'm not hearing a lot of other things. We aim at interested adults, 18 and up. We aim to look at the big picture of climate change with as many different disciplinary angles as we can scare up. So we have a lot of arts and humanities and applied sciences and ecology as well as climate science. And what we try to do is locate and annotate and post really readable, high quality information, college level content, primer level clarity, really readable and as much as possible actually engaging and entertaining articles, essays, books, websites, and videos, both short and long. So that's it.
Great. So I want to start by telling you a couple stories. But the first one is not quite a story. It's a report, first of all. Let's call it the Queen and the King. Here's the report. The Queen died. Next bullet point. The King died. Results, they're both dead. Too bad. I don't know how I feel about it. They might have been great kings and queens. They might have been despots. Whatever. Now I'm going to tell it as a story. The Queen died. The King died of a broken heart. Only 4 words have been added. And what do we have now that's different? We have cause and effect. We have consequence. We have an appeal to emotion. And while this is among the shortest stories possible, I think you found an entryway to connect with the telling of the story. Maybe there were despots, but gee, the king, the big lug, loved her anyway. I can feel for him a little bit. Maybe they were great. Maybe he lived for years on, whatever. You start entering it. So what I'd like to do in this talk is talk about not just stories, but why stories seem to work better than non-narrative information when they're used judiciously in talks by especially scientists talking to the public, not necessarily just to this room. So here's a more complicated story, but still brief. 1989, in December, a 747 jumbo jet flew from Amsterdam to Tokyo and scheduled to refuel in Anchorage, Alaska. And as it entered Alaska airspace, it was told that this beautiful mountain, which also happens to be a volcano, Redoubt volcano, had just erupted for the first time in 20 years. There was some thought that maybe that was going to happen, and so they took on extra fuel to divert if they had to. But there are no abilities on a plane then or now to differentiate in clouds between an ash cloud and a regular cloud. That's what the eruption actually looked like. And the ash went up about 7.5 miles within, an hour or less. And what happens at that point is that winds take over, and the ash moves far away from the source, which is the volcano itself. Okay, this volcano is more than 100 miles away from Anchorage. So on went the plane. And without noticing what they were really running into, the pilots noticed a slightly bruised-looking cloud, and they flew into it at about 500 miles per hour. Within about 5 seconds, their windshield, which is acrylic, was completely abraded so that there was no sight possible. Ash is made of a kind of millions of bits of tiny glass, okay? The pilot could no longer see outside. She could no longer see, in fact, in another 10 seconds, her co-pilot. And the cockpit and the passenger cabin had a deep smell of sulfur. Lights went out in the passenger cabin. And things didn't look too good. There was St. Elmo's fire floating on the wings, okay? The pilot tried to divert by going up out of the cloud and very quickly noticed that she was losing airspeed. Within another minute or so, the first of the 4 engines shut down. Then the second engine shut down, and within about another 10 seconds, the other 2 engines shut down. They were about 7 miles, no, they were about 5 miles above the 10,000-foot mountains in that part of Alaska. And so the plane, in a great mechanical silence, started to drop. They tried to restart the engines. That's not, you don't just switch a quick key. It didn't work. They tried again. It didn't work. The pilot called Anchorage, and she said, "Anchorage, we are in a fall." And I have her voice in my computer at home. Inside the passenger cabin, the smell of sulfur got stronger. Cups, styrofoam cups, big fat Stephen King novels and so forth began to float as the plane dropped. Now I want to make another point about storytelling, so I think I'll go on and make point number 2. Or would you rather hear the end of this story? Set up. Why do you want to hear the end of the story? Because you're invested, right? And so what happened? Eventually it fell out of the ash cloud. No more new ash was being sucked into the engines. And finally, one of those tries to turn the engine on was successful. And one engine started. A few seconds later, a second engine started. And 2 is all you need to stay afloat. And they were about 1,000 or 2,000 feet above the top of the mountains by the time they leveled off and landed by instruments in broad daylight, sunny, at Anchorage. Okay, conclusion, nobody... This proves you're invested in the story, okay? This is the only graph that exists in my world of literature and creative writing. It's called Freytag's triangle. And it shows what I just talked to you about, okay? The grounded situations, the plane's heading towards Alaska, and then maybe there's a rise in tension, that is, something's about to happen. The volcano goes off, okay? Another obstacle is that the wind moves it along, and the plane suddenly, not thinking it was anywhere near it, in fact, is near it, okay? Next obstacle, next thing, next uh-oh moment, the engine goes down. Then another engine goes down, and so forth, okay? They try to start it, and so forth. At the high point, that's the climax of the story, or the turn of the action, the first engine goes back on, okay? And then we have the denouement, the falling action, and so forth. This is true for both nonfiction and fiction stories told in narrative fashion and different from bullet points, okay? Oh, so I'm glad it didn't click, because here's what I want to say. When you're listening to this, relatively new research has shown that more parts of your brain are activated by hearing narrative, by hearing a story, than by taking in information in a non-narrative kind of way. And so as I told this story, which is just a more complicated version of the queen died and the king died of a broken heart, when you hear about smell, a part of your brain that deals with smell is activated. When you hear about fear, a different part is activated, and so forth, and so on. We are wired for story as a species. It's one of the earliest things we do. Tell me a story, please. Campfire story, NPR radio story, all these kinds of stories are part of our lives. Anybody know what Morpeg is? Massively multiplayer online role-playing games. How many million young people are doing those right now? They're stories. You're playing a role. Even when we sleep, even when we're not awake, we are telling stories, hearing stories. Here's my idea of an equation for you. Let D stand for daydream. Apparently the average daydream is 14 seconds, and we can have up to 2,000 a day. Conclusion, wow. We're homo narrans. We're storytelling animals. What does this have to do with science? How can this very core human capacity be used to advantage? 50 years ago, Rachel Carson did Silent Spring. She had a difficult story to tell about chemicals, about ecological chain of being, and, hard to do. She started with a fable. I don't know if any of you remember that, but that's how she started the book. There once was a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. That's how she starts it. And then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Well, right, she's talking about DDT. We know this. But notice how she uses the story trope, you might say. And she speaks pointedly of children, bringing in human beings. This is basically what her strategy was. The strategy is a stranger comes to town and then important things begin to change. Thus, a community or a person is forced to act or adapt, okay? She did it soberly and with the evidence of science, but basically she used the idea of a stranger comes to town. Other kinds. A nice stranger, E.T., helps the kid. Great Gatsby, Gatsby moves in. He's a stranger. Suddenly there's this narrator that hears about this rich man. Metamorphosis, the guy wakes up as a giant bug. The stranger is inside him. Rosemary's Baby, the stranger is in her womb, okay? And so forth and so on. Perfectly suited to climate change. Elizabeth Kolbert, this is the book that got me started on my interest in this. What is she going to do? She's going to use a different strategy. And I'm probably going to have to end with that because it's just a few minutes, right? Difficulty, this is my best slide. This is what most people think of as climate change. They can't see it. You can have over here, 280, Industrial Revolution, 400 over here, 600 over here for the future. It all looks the same. So Kolbert went to Alaska. She went to Greenland. She went out on the road and brought back the stories of other people who had been out on the road. It's called Field Notes from a Catastrophe. Here's the strategy that she's using. And of course, she talked about people, and look at those nice faces of those nice teenagers. She used the trope, the idea of a hero goes on a journey, the most common of all stories, and it's in almost anything you want to talk about. And this is to your advantage, okay? Now, it used to be, that in American literature anyway, it's a very male-dominated sort of thing, okay? But this is at the Denver airport. You may have seen it. She's a CSU researcher. It's clear that this advertising campaign shows her in a hero journey position. Susan Solomon, a few years ago. Nalini Nadkarni, she's going on a journey up the tree, okay? It does not mean that when you put yourself in the position of a hero, or you talk about another scientist or your team, it does not mean that you are saying you are heroic, okay? You can do a journey in research. You can do an intellectual journey. You can talk about that. And it will have a certain kind of appeal to audiences that other kinds of things do not. Direct quote from a young researcher one afternoon in my lab. My colleagues and I were trying to measure how much more CO2 in the air helps plants to grow faster when we were shocked to see. We went on a journey. We had a challenge. We didn't realize it. We had to overcome it. You could also call this the Sherlock Holmes kind of whodunit story. And those are my conclusions.